I have to tell you, Mr. President, last weekend I spent time down at the southwest border, an area the chair is very familiar with. This time I was in the Rio Grande Valley. In the Rio Grande Valley area is the highest area of crossings illegally across our entire 2,000-mile southwest border. In fact, it's interesting to be able to track just the movement across that border. This is over from 2014 to 2022, what's happened along this area of the border. Just this one specific area, what's called the Rio Grande Valley area, around McAllen, Brownsville, that area. This shows each year what happened. It starts in October, way down here with the numbers low, and then some years it came up, but just about every year it came up and down, and was down significantly in November, December, because again, in Central America, they celebrate Christmas as well. And a lot of folks want to head back home even, or be there. And so immigration doesn't cross from south to north significantly most years in October, November, December, January. Except for this really odd line right here that seems really out of balance with all the rest of the lines from the last decade. It's this line right here. This line is actually last year. This line shows the number 2 million people that have illegally crossed our southwest border last year that we know of. 2 million. That's this line. And in typically every other year, it's way down low. When you get to October, November, December, that's over here. Here's those low months. Not this year. It's already started way up high. In fact, what's interesting is October, November, December, if you took any one of those months, there are as many people illegally crossing the border in the Rio Grande Valley in October, November, or December as the last 3 years in that month combined. Let me run that past everybody again. You take any month, October, November, December, they were higher illegal crossings that we know of than the last 3 years combined, than any year that we know of. My fear is, as some people have said, we have a problem on our southern border. I actually believe the Biden administration policy is working exactly as they designed it to work. Exactly. They created a structure and a system to allow as many people as possible to be able to cross our southern border, and it's working exactly. Why would I say that? Well, in the first days of the Biden presidency, when you stop border wall construction, when you announce they're going to change dramatically every policy for how we're interdicting individuals, when they cancel all foreign agreements with Mexico and with Central America that's actually limiting the number of people there, and then you don't replace it with anything, you've got to know this is what's going to happen. And a year later, when nothing has changed, this is what's going to happen. The agents in the Rio Grande Valley that I talked to anticipate by the time we get to the summer, we're going to be at 9,000 people a day illegally crossing our southern border, a day. There are many months in the past that we didn't have that many people crossing the border illegally. They're anticipating on this trend line, 9,000 a day that are coming. And so far, what has the Biden administration done? They've stuck with their plan because it's doing exactly what they thought it was going to do. Now, I'm amazed the number of people that I talked to that have grown numb to what's happening on our southern border, and the media has just looked away and said, we've talked about how bad it is for a year, that's old news now. And so they no longer talk about the 2 million people that have illegally crossed our border. But going down last weekend and spending time with the Border Patrol, CBP, ICE, and other leaders that are there, they could tell me firsthand the stories of last week, late at night, the 5 Syrians that they picked up crossing the southern border in the brush. Those 5 Syrians were part of the count of the 2 million people from last year that will now be who knows how big this year. They told me directly the story of the Nicaraguan single adult male that they picked up crossing the border in the Rio Grande Valley, who told them, when under questioning, he was a member of the Nicaraguan military. Within 48 hours, he was released in the United States. And they were furious about it. Their question was very, very simple. A single adult male, member of a foreign military, is now somewhere in our country, and they have no idea why. Because they're doing their job, but the policies that they have to work with right now of how many people they have to be able to cut loose and how hard it is to be able to detain people, and the limiting policies of the Biden administration are fulfilling exactly what it's designed to do. There's been a lot of conversation on this floor, and I brought several times to this body the construction of the border barriers down in the Southwest. This is something that members of the Border Patrol have asked for again and again and again. Close the gaps, that they always say, close the gaps. There are these massive gaps where there was under construction in January the 20th of last year, construction stopped. And over again, people have said, close the gaps, those gaps we have to patrol. Well, let me give you an example. When I got down there, they've now announced, by the way, they are closing the gaps, and everyone went, great, the gaps are being closed. But I got down there to be able to look at the gaps being closed, and let me show you what it looks like. This is an aerial shot when we were up in a helicopter with CBP, getting a chance to be able to literally watch people crossing the border illegally. And from this aerial shot, I hope you can see, this was the existing wall that was constructed during the Trump administration, this tall 30-foot wall with the anti-climb portion on it. Here's where the construction stopped. It was all the way through here, and then there was a gap, and then they had started another section here, and we're getting ready to be able to put up the other sections, but they had to stop. The Biden administration's now announced they're going to close the gaps. I hope you don't miss it. They've announced the gaps are closed. Can you see this tiny little picket fence on the bottom here? Probably not. This tiny little picket fence that's at the bottom, that's what they say is close the gaps. So it's no longer just open. They have a tiny little decorative fence there, and that's their announced, we've closed the gap. That's not going to deter anyone. They know it full well. It's not designed to deter anyone. It's designed to allow the administration to say, we closed the gap, and hope no one looks at it, because that gap will fulfill exactly what it is designed to fulfill, that is to allow people in, not keep people out. That doesn't help the Border Patrol, and they know it, because it's not designed to be able to help the Border Patrol, and they know it. Federal courts required the Biden administration to put in place what was a Trump policy before dealing with those individuals coming to seek asylum in the United States. It's called MPP. Some people call it Remain in Mexico. This policy basically said if you want to be able to come into the country, you had to pause, get in line, register so we'd know who you are. We'd set up an orderly process, and then you'd have to stay in the border region until it was time for your hearing to occur. There was a dramatic drop in individuals that were illegally crossing our border because they knew they wouldn't automatically get in, what's called catch and release, that they wouldn't just come across, be released in the country, and wait 2 years until their hearing. 2 years, that's what it used to be able to wait till the hearing. Until they shifted to the Remain in Mexico policy, and they said they have to stay here in the border region until it's time for your hearing. Within months, they would come forward, they would get their hearing and get to make their determination whether they fulfilled asylum or not. Federal courts have said to the Biden administration, you have to put that policy back in place. So after months of delay, they have agreed to do it. It was one of the places I want to stop in and see. This is an overview of the Brownsville location for the Remain in Mexico policy. This overview shows the setup that they have created there in Brownsville to do the hearings. There's an intake area for processing, gathering area, medical area. There are 6 courtrooms that are set up. The courtrooms that are set up are all set up as large courtrooms where up to 22 different defendants could be here with their attorneys. All the courtrooms have video conferencing set up as a full-on courtroom for that location. There are in each location 120 individual office spaces set up, 120, where individuals that had illegally crossed the border could meet with their lawyer. So 6 courtrooms, 120 meeting spaces, all the ancillary space. This is a massive complex. When I was down there last week, they have so far handled 3 people. 3. and they weren't sure how many they were going to handle this week. Why? Because the Remain in Mexico policy, MPP, whatever you want to be able to call it, they created a system with so many exceptions in it that they could tell the federal courts, yes, we're doing it, but in reality, they're not. Realizing this month they've had about 45,000 people illegally cross the border in this zone just in January, but only 3 they made eligible to go through this process of the 45,000. Why? Well, they made a whole set of stipulations. They said, if you come in a family group, you're not eligible to come in here. If you declare that you have a medical issue of any type, no matter how minor it may be, you're not eligible to be able to go through this program. If you're LGBT, you're not eligible to be able to go through this program. If you're 75 years or older, you're not eligible to be able to go through this program. If you're Nicaraguan, you're not eligible to go through this program. If you're Venezuelan, you're not eligible to go through this program. You get the hint? They set so many criteria up to be able to list out no, 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 that the poor 3 people that were left that didn't fit in that categories, they're going through it. By the way, each person is given 24 hours with their lawyer before they actually have to go through this process, so counsel could give them the full list of all the items that they could select and say, if you meet any of these criteria verbally, if you just say you meet any of these criteria, then you're out. And what does you're out mean? You're released into the United States and you await your hearing. Remember when I said during the Trump administration, those hearings would take up to 2 years before you got to an asylum hearing? Well, when I met with DHS officials this week, it's not 2 years anymore, it's now 6 years. You illegally cross the border, you get a paper, they release you into the country, you get on a bus or on a plane, literally go anywhere you want to go in the country and set a date 6 years from now to show up at your court hearing. That's on average, by the way. Some are longer than that. Now you tell me, what happens if someone illegally crosses the border, they're processed within 48 hours, given a document that says you can be here 6 years to go anywhere you want to go in the country, what do you think they're going to do when they pick up their cell phone? I'll tell you what's happening. They're texting a family member back home, they're texting friends back home and saying, I got in, and here's how I did it. Come join me. And they are. 2 million people last year. And the response so far has been decorative fencing, what they actually call guardrails in the area, and empty courtrooms. By the way, this was middle of the day when I was there. Empty courtrooms with no one being processed. Also, they can say they did something. American taxpayers paid millions of dollars for this setup. So they could say they're doing something when they're actually doing nothing, getting the results exactly as they planned. Oh, but of course, everyone's being required to be vaccinated correctly before they reach the country. Of course, everyone's being required to be vaccinated, except they're not. If you're a legal green card holder, you are required to be vaccinated. President Biden is trying to vaccinate everyone in private businesses, in the federal workforce, federal contractors. Members of the military being kicked out of the military this week if they're not vaccinated. Oh, but if you cross the border illegally, you're given the option whether you want a vaccine or not. It's offered to you for free, but it's not mandated, it's voluntary. What's the result? Well, some of the results are pretty obvious. The numbers are skyrocketing. As I showed you before, these are record numbers of individuals crossing the border illegally. That's seeable. Let me tell you what's not seeable at this point. The drug cartels in Mexico are getting richer and richer and richer. They're moving record amounts of drugs across our border, making an incredible amount of money for the cartels, continuing to strengthen those drug cartels on the border. But each of the individuals that cross our southern border also pay a fee to the cartels. each of them. You don't cross the southern border into the United States without crossing through one of the cartel areas, and each one of them has to pay. It's somewhere around $4,000 to $30,000 per person to be able to cross through Mexico and into the United States. $4,000 if you're from Guatemala, $30,000 if you're from China. And none of us should be surprised. Just last year, people from more than 100 countries crossed into the United States that we picked up and interdicted illegally. More than 100 countries. This common conversation about, well, it's all folks from Central America. There are a lot of folks from Central America coming. But it's people from over 100 countries, including those 5 Syrians that were picked up just last week. Do some rough math. If people pay between $4,000 and $30,000 a person, and there were 2 million people that crossed illegally last year that we know of, that's $10 billion paid to the cartels. $10 billion. And our open borders are allowing the cartels to rake in that kind of cash. When I visited with the Border Patrol and got a chance to be able to talk to them, their morale is awful, as you can imagine. They're doing their job. They're busting it every day. But they're frustrated. They're frustrated at the policies that they're having to enforce. When there used to be law enforcement folks enforcing our southern border, now they're hotel check-in staff that are just greeting people at the border, processing them, and releasing them into the country. That is not what they signed up for. They signed up to protect our country. And literally, they cannot. In this case, law enforcement is handcuffed, and the criminals are released. It shouldn't be that way, and they know it. Usually, October, November, December, January are lower months. Not so this time. They're exhausted from a record amount of illegal crossings last year, and they were hoping to get a bit of a break. But with the policies in place, didn't matter how cold it is, people are still coming. And on top of all that, here's what else happened last month. Just one example. This is a Border Patrol vehicle that had just interdicted a group of folks at the border. I don't know whether you can see it or not, but that's a giant bullet hole in the front of it. And that's another bullet hole in it. And that's another bullet hole right behind the passenger window. By the way, this particular moment, they had actually already picked somebody up and they were sitting in that back seat. The Border Patrol every day risks their lives to be able to enforce the law. And for this group of folks they pick up, within hours, they're released. And they're somewhere in the country waiting on a court hearing 6 years from now, if they ever show up for the hearing. You want to know how frustrated this group of law enforcement is? They risk their lives for nothing, because this is the policy of the Biden administration. This is not an accident. This is what it has brought. As they run through tonight the heavy brush along a very cold Texas-Mexico border, they will pick people up and they will faithfully do their job, because they have over and over and over again, only to have a policy that cuts them loose. How long? Listen, Border Patrol agents have families too. Their families matter as well. And all this talk about we're going to be compassionate to the families of people illegally crossing the border, what we're really doing as a policy is enriching the cartels in Mexico, encouraging people to make a very dangerous journey, releasing them into the country with non-legal status to live in the shadows in our nation, and putting law enforcement at risk for their life. This should not be. And while the country just seems to move on and ignore the chaos at our border, this is still what's going on tonight. And it needs to stop. This administration has the ability to change policy and to change direction on our southern border, and they are not. They are not doing it on purpose. And the results are chaos. I wish I was wrong on this. There's something called Title 42. Title 42 means we have a COVID epidemic happening, no kidding. And under a COVID epidemic, or under any kind of epidemic, law enforcement is able to take some individuals, single adults from certain countries, and turn them around, and to send them right back in and say, you can't come in because of the epidemic. We have enormous numbers of those individuals coming. And right now, some of those individuals from some of those countries are being turned around, thankfully. And when I've asked DHS, what is your plan for those individuals once the COVID epidemic ends? And it does, God willing, end one day. When it ends, what is your plan? We're now 13 months into this administration, and they still have no plan. That's not just my guess. That's my point-blank asking. What is the plan to turn people around once the COVID epidemic, for that small group of folks you are turning around? They don't have one. It doesn't take 13 months to be able to determine what you're going to do. That just tells me the plan is, when the COVID epidemic ends, those folks get in too. When does this end? Who's going to stand up and help us just enforce the laws of our country? I yield the floor.